Hello, my name is John Long, and this is for Communications 532. I'm doing my presentation on video games, and I hope that you will find this to be a fun and informative presentation. To begin, I would like to say that video games are important, and we should study them. Why study video games? Well, first, 72% of American households play video games. Mine happens to be one of them. 55% of gamers play on mobile devices, things like this, and also what I'm running my presentation on. So, video game hardware and games generate billions in revenue each year, and new gaming devices and games are pushing the boundaries of creativity and technology. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about video games is that they are a real medium. Let's take, for instance, Call of Duty. This is Call of Duty Black Ops right here. It's an Xbox 360 game. Its opening sales were $360 million. Now, that's important because when you take in what the Avengers movie did, it only took in $207 million on its opening day worldwide. And then Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, that book, was much less. I only have comparisons for US, and that's $170 million, but it was less than the other two compared to the video game Call of Duty Black Ops. So that's a pretty big deal. There are other influences as well that I'd like to point out. You have the Big Bang Theory. You have movies like Wreck-It Ralph and early Tron. Then you have the Penny Arcade Expo, and you have things like Comic-Con. So those are some of the many things that make up the world. You also have marketing that extends to where you have your own video game brands like this Mario cartoon. And it's also important to mention that there are magazines that have popped up. This is Game Informer. It is one of about 12 different video game specific magazines, as well as books for gaming, like this Pokemon book or this very thick Skyrim book. I don't know if you can see that right there. So a whole industry has popped up and popped up in a big way. So let's understand video games a little bit better. What is a video game? Well, according to our textbook, video games is a catch-all term that includes games with a visual and usually an audio stimulus, and it's played through a digitally mediated system. Now, video games are available as software for other digital devices like home computers, again, mobile phones and tablets, and standalone systems, the old arcade cabinets where you actually stood up to play. By the way, that's Pac-Man. And software for other gaming-specific systems, different platforms. I'm running the Wii U in the background right now. So that's relatively important. And then you need to look at video game systems. What will they have? Well, they're going to have a display. And, you know, the smartphones that you might play on have a display. This is Game Boy, one of the earliest handhelds. And, you know, even with the Wii U, you have a display here. And I'm also displaying it on my television. You have a microprocessor which runs the game. You've got the gaming software. For instance, you'll have cartridges. This one here is an old cartridge for a Game Boy type, and this is actually for Nintendo DS. It's much smaller. And we also have CDs that run games as well. So, and then finally, you need some form of input device. So let's see what we have here. This is a Wii controller. This Wii U also doubles as a controller. Xbox, that's a controller. And if you're into computer gaming, you might use a keyboard. So those are just some of the variations that are out there. So now that we understand what video games are and what makes up a video game system, let's go back in time a little bit and kind of follow the timeline up through the present. So, depending on who you ask, there are between 7 and 14 different phases within video game history. However, Grant and Meadows, the writers of our textbook, have collapsed those into 5 categories. And the first category is the early years, the 1960s actually. During this time, MIT created a game called Space War for the Pentagon. This was actually a military project. You had Ralph Bauer, who is considered the father of video games in a lot of ways, created a rudimentary hockey game for the Department of Defense. They were none too pleased. And then Bauer also invented a game a little bit later called Chase. That came out in the late 60s. But it was important because it was the first video game to be displayed on a television screen. So then, after the early years, we have the rise of the console. This is the early 70s to mid 80s, and this was a time I was familiar with. I was born in 1974. Pong came out in arcades 1977, and the first Atari 2600, I believe, came out in 1977 as well. So this is really where video games started to get their bite. You had Magnavox Odyssey that came out in 1972. It used analog components. You would actually have dice and money and little inserts for the cartridges that you would use. Atari launched its home version of Pong, which was hugely popular at the time. And then Atari 2600 came out, as I said, in 1977 and led the way for the second generation of video games, and they used the little cartridges, not this size, actually about like that. And then game licensing also began. You had games like E.T. and Indiana Jones and various others, and that licensing has gone on today. That's how you can have a movie like Cars turn into a video game about cars. So very interesting stuff. It's also interesting to note that during this time, the Nintendo Entertainment System, called the NES, we used 8-bit technology, as did the Sega Master System. However, the NES became the best-selling video game system in the US in 1987. That was a pretty big deal. It's also important to understand that as this evolution continued, with the 8-bit technology, Jumpman, that started out as an arcade character you may have seen in Donkey Kong and in some of the other games, became Mario. And as you can see from the toy merchandise here, Mario's become a big deal. One thing I feel like I need to mention in between are arcades and computer gaming. What happened to them during this time? Well, briefly, for the video arcade, it rose in the 70s, kind of peaked in the 80s, started to drop off heavily in the 90s, and by the new millennium, it was gone. A lot of that was due to the success of the home console. For computer gaming, early games like Zork and Bard's Tale were text-based. Then the Commodore 64 came along and introduced color, which was very important, and allowed gamers something that they could build games for. And the Apple Macintosh provided a point-and-click interface, so add-ons like joysticks weren't needed to play the games. However, it's important to note that sales lagged behind home consoles for quite some time. All right, now we get to the third category, and that is portable gaming. Another important step in the evolution of video games. This is from the early 1980s to the present still. We still have handhelds. But it started out with Mattel's rudimentary handheld electric football that debuted in the early 80s. It was not much of a video game, had a little red blip, and how much that lit up or didn't light up told you what your avatar was doing. It was less of a video game than a machine, in my opinion, but it was an early stage handheld. Atari launched the Lynx, which had pretty good graphics for the time. However, there weren't a lot of titles to support it. Third-party vendors didn't support it, so it kind of went crash. Then Nintendo launched the ever-popular Game Boy, the handheld that's really started it all and made all the difference. It did not start out with color graphics. It had a little screen similar to that green color with little black pixels. But it was fun, it was easy, and it had a lot of titles that people recognized. Plus, you see these controllers? This controller was the same kind of controller you'd find on NES, so people didn't have to relearn the game controls. It was already there. That was a pretty big deal. So what else? Handhelds began to reach parity with their consoles. If you had, say, a Nintendo NES, you probably had a Game Boy in your house as well. So the lines between the third and fourth generation video games begin to get blurred here. And programmers now have a variety of stable platforms in which they can build games for. So they're happy, they're making money. The industry is starting to grow. It's also important to note that in 2001, Sony launched the PSP, the PlayStation Portable. It was capable of playing games and watching movies and even having online access, and that really helped it start to stand apart from just traditional game-only devices. Depending on who you ask, there are between 7 and 14 different phases. I mentioned that. And we are now in the fourth category, which is the console wars. And during this time, in the mid-1990s, Nintendo and Sega were battling it out pretty heavy. Nintendo finally pushed Sega out of the console market. However, Sony entered the console market with the PlayStation. Now, that happened in 1995. Now, what's interesting about this, and as you'll see in my presentation, I highlighted it in yellow, this was really the introduction of mature content into video games. So the family-friendly stuff that you see there started to get replaced by darker stuff like Call of Duty, and although this Call of Duty came much later, games like, well, just darker games. So that's very important to note. Processing power allowed games to become better stories, more graphic details. So this led to the ISDA eventually creating a rating system, and that would they would actually eventually change the name to, I believe, the ESA. 2001 was a very big year in the console wars because Microsoft launched its Xbox, and when that debuted, it really started to blur the lines between computer programming, computer gaming, and what home-based console gaming was. It had the power of the computer in a gaming system, the home console. Also important to note, Nintendo released the Wii system. And this came out in 2006, and it was a motion-based game. It used a little controller like this and had something called a nunchuck, so you could actually have two of them. But what was surprising is the traditional younger audience that we think about with video games, well, all of a sudden senior citizens started getting involved. They started gaming, and they started doing things with their grandchildren as well. Gaming started to become a family event. So that was a really huge bridge and growth opportunity for the video game market. And then later, 2013, the Wii U, as you see in the background, was released. Microsoft Xbox One and the Sony PS4 spent quite a bit of time in 2014 battling it out, especially for the holiday season, to be top dog in the gaming system. Now, what's interesting about those is they offered a robust media hub with things like Netflix, DVD and Blu-ray capabilities, and specialty title games that you could only get through those systems. Today, it's probably best to say the big three are PS4, Xbox One, and Nintendo with their current Wii and Wii U systems. Now we're on to our fifth and final category. That's online and mobile gaming. This takes place between the mid-90s and still runs through the present. Wireless networks extend the ability to play online-based games to handheld phones. And both dedicated devices like the Nintendo DS and consumer-oriented mobile devices and tablets now have the ability to play games. So platforms are less relevant. You might be playing a game on one device and somebody else might be playing the same game on a different device. Sony's PlayStation Vista came out, and it started to blur the lines between gaming devices and smartphones. It had much of the capabilities you expect in a smartphone with 3G wireless and Wi-Fi, GPS, motion sensors, built-in camera, touchpads, all kinds of things, and a very nice OLED display. Social networking gave rise to social gaming. MySpace, Facebook, Google Plus, and other games started to release games like Farmville and Candy Crush. And actually on my phone I'm displaying Doodle Jump right now. I don't know if you can see that. But I have a trivia crack game that I play with my wife all the time. It's a very social game. I can connect with my friends, and we really enjoy that. These games use time-lapse efforts to encourage users to return and continue gaming. Social and mobile-friendly games also led to women representing the largest share of the gaming population. A lot of people don't know that. And many games, mobile games on cell phones and mobile devices, offered virtual items for real currency. So you could buy things in a virtual universe using real hard-earned cash. That's also very interesting. So, the final piece of this are MMORPGs, which are multiplayer role-playing games. You will find this in World of Warcraft, which is one of the most successful games out there. It boasts 10 million subscribers, and it allows for a distributed user base to share a single game. So they all exist in the same cyber universe, this virtual universe. They're all playing at the same time. And they also offer highly developed game economies and basically classified ads online where you can buy characters that you didn't necessarily earn and items you didn't necessarily earn for real money. So that's been a bit of controversy in the gaming community, but that does exist. And finally, we need to look, well, not finally, but we need to look at the regulatory environment for games. I mentioned earlier the ESA, formerly the ISDA. They created a standard video game rating system that includes more than half a dozen categories and more than 20 content descriptions. But there's been some controversy, and that probably is most recognizable in the Grand Theft Auto series. At one point, they provided downloadable patches that opened up sexually explicit content and violent content, and that can be a real problem when you consider youth. Part of the self-regulation and legislative efforts have been to protect children. I failed to mention that. Because the legislative landscape continues to treat video games as a child-oriented medium, and this is not necessarily the case, but I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of kids that play these games. The Sandy Hook school shooting brought a renewed attention to video game violence. However, it's been very difficult to find links between that shooter and video game violence, as with other violent actions that have happened in the past that video games have been blamed for. So we also need to look at downloads for consoles, PCs, and more. 3, you have mobile devices using the Apple App Store, Google Play. This provides casual games for smartphones and mobile devices. The virtual cache, which I kind of mentioned before. Consoles, Xbox Live Marketplace, Xbox Live Arcade, WiiWare, PlayStation Network. These offer movies and Netflix and Facebook and exclusive games and direct-to-console downloads. This is very important because no longer are you having to worry about the boxing and the marketing and so forth that you do traditionally. Broadband has enabled downloads to actually reduce their overall physical overhead cost. So you can go right through your gaming marketplace and purchase the game that you want. And the same is for PCs. PCs have online classifieds and virtual cache, I mentioned, and direct-to-PC downloads. So a game that you may purchase can be done directly from your PC to your computer. Some quick useful facts. I mentioned earlier, women account for 45% of all gamers, and that figure is expected to grow. The average video game player is not a child, is 30 years of age. And in 2013, U.S. income from video games totaled more than $15.4 billion. $2 billion of that figure was in rentals. Other factors to watch, the Ocular Rift headsets will pave the way for the virtual reality movement where you will actually be fully immersed in the game that you're playing. There are already some well-recognized titles available. Crowd-funded sites like Kickstart may continue to grow, and these have funded things like the Oculus Rift and have received over $1 billion in pledges to date. Downloaded content sites like Steam may be the wave of the future for purchasing games. They boast over 65 million accounts for computer platforms. And the U.S. military will continue to play the role that it essentially started, which is being involved in the development of video game technology. And right now, the game Close Combat is being used by the U.S. Marine Corps. And then you have voice over internet protocol systems. These may bring teleconferencing to gaming, so things like live poker, chess, board games, things like that, and who knows, other things can now be a part of your game. So, this leads me to my question. Do you believe video games have a positive or negative cultural impact on society? And what, if any, effect do you think it will have on Christian identity? Can't wait to read your answers. Thank you so much for watching this presentation. I'm John Long.